Stephen Colbert thought he could humiliate Kristi Noem with condescending jokes about dumb blonde politicians from flyover states. What happened next exposed him as an out-of-touch elitist and ended his comedy career in the most spectacular late-night television meltdown ever recorded. The Ed Sullivan Theater in Manhattan buzzed with its usual pre-show energy that Tuesday evening in March, as audience members filed in for what they expected to be another night of political comedy and liberal talking points. Stephen Colbert sat behind his desk reviewing his notes for what he'd privately called his Gnome Destruction segment, a carefully crafted character assassination disguised as comedy that would reduce the South Dakota governor to a laughingstock. Governor Kristi Noem sat in the green room wearing a sharp navy blazer and reviewing her own notes in a leather portfolio. She'd agreed to appear on The Late Show, despite warnings from her staff that Colbert would likely attempt to humiliate her with condescending jokes about rural Republicans and backward red state policies. But Noem had spent the past week preparing for exactly this kind of attack, researching Colbert's background and preparing responses that would expose his hypocrisy. Colbert had been planning this interview for weeks, ever since Noem had criticized Hollywood elites for their disconnection from ordinary Americans during a Fox News appearance. His writing team had compiled what they called a comprehensive mockery file, jokes about her appearance, her rural background, and her political positions that would play perfectly to his liberal New York audience. As the cameras rolled and the familiar Late Show theme played, Colbert launched into his monologue with the smug confidence that had made him a darling of progressive media. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we're joined by South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, who's here to tell us about life in one of those states that the rest of us fly over to get to places that matter. The audience laughed appreciatively, setting the tone for what they expected would be a one-sided roasting. When Noem took her seat across from Colbert's desk, he immediately began his attack with the kind of condescending humor that had become his trademark. Governor Noem, thank you for joining us. I have to say it's refreshing to have someone on the show who represents real America. You know, the parts where people still think the earth is flat and vaccines cause autism. Sherbina, more laughter from the audience who were eating up Colbert's superior attitude. Noem smiled politely, showing no reaction to the insult. Thank you for having me, Stephen. Though I have to say your characterization of South Dakota suggests you've never actually been there. Oh, I'm sure it's lovely, Colbert replied with theatrical sarcasm. All that corn and whatever else you grow out there. Probably not a lot of bookstores, though, right? I imagine most of your constituents get their information from Facebook and Fox News. It was his first major probe designed to make Noem look intellectually inferior while positioning himself as the educated, sophisticated urbanite. But Noem was ready for this exact attack. That's interesting that you mentioned books, Stephen, she said, opening her portfolio. What's the last book you read cover to cover? The question caught Colbert completely off guard. His confident smirk faltered as he realized he'd just been put on the spot by someone he'd assumed would be an easy target. Well, I read a lot of books, he stammered clearly, stalling for time. I mean, I'm constantly reading for the show research, you know. I asked for a specific title, Noem pressed gently. The last complete book you read from beginning to end. Colbert's face was starting to redden as he realized he couldn't answer the question. With the show schedule, I mostly read articles, briefings. So you haven't actually read a complete book recently, Noem observed. That's interesting because you just suggested that people in South Dakota don't read books, but it sounds like you don't either. The audience was getting uncomfortable, sensing that their host was being outmaneuvered by someone they'd expected him to easily mock. I read plenty, Colbert said defensively. I went to Northwestern. I studied theater. You studied theater, Noem repeated. At Northwestern, a private university that costs over $60,000 a year. Tell me, Stephen, how did you afford that education? Colbert shifted uncomfortably in his chair. My family. We worked hard. Now, your father was a prominent doctor, and your mother came from a wealthy Charleston family, Noem said, pulling out a document from her portfolio. You attended private prep schools, had family connections in the entertainment industry, and never worked a job outside of comedy and television. She looked directly at him. So when you mock working-class Americans for getting their information from Facebook instead of books, you're talking about people who've actually worked real jobs their entire lives. While you've been supported by family wealth since birth, The studio was getting quieter, the audience beginning to realize that their intellectual hero was being systematically dismantled by someone he'd tried to portray as ignorant. Now, wait a minute. Colbert protested, his usual quick wit completely absent. I've worked hard to get where I am. Have you? Noam interrupted. Because from what I can see, you've spent your entire career making fun of people who actually build things, grow things, and create value in the real economy. What exactly have you built, Stephen? What have you created besides jokes mocking people who work harder than you? She leaned forward slightly. I started working on my family's farm when I was a teenager. I helped build our family business from the ground up. I've met payroll, dealt with regulations, managed employees. I've actually created jobs and economic value. Colbert tried to regain control with another joke. Well, I create laughter, which is valuable. You create laughter by mocking people who've never had the advantages you've had. Noam cut him off. You make millions of dollars a year ridiculing working families who are struggling to pay their bills, and your audience applauds because it makes them feel superior to people they've never met. The audience was now completely silent, many looking uncomfortable as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented, their host being intellectually destroyed by someone he'd tried to humiliate. But here's what really bothers me about your approach, Stephen. Noam continued, her voice taking on a more serious tone. You claim to represent progressive values, to care about working people, but your entire career is built on looking down on them. She pulled out another document. You make $15 million a year mocking people who make $50,000. You live in a mansion in New Jersey while making jokes about people who live in trailer parks. You send your kids to elite private schools while criticizing public education in rural areas. Colbert was visibly sweating now, his usual confidence completely shattered. And the most ironic part, Noam said, is that you present yourself as some kind of intellectual, but you just admitted you don't actually read books. You mock people for getting their information from social media while you get your information from comedy writers and liberal talking points. She closed her portfolio and looked directly at him. So tell me, Stephen, who's really the dumb blonde here? The governor who built a business, earned a political science degree, and actually knows her policy positions, or the comedian who makes jokes about subjects he's never studied, mocks people he's never met, and can't even name the last book he read? The silence that followed was deafening. Colbert sat frozen behind his desk, completely unable to respond to someone who just exposed him as everything he claimed to oppose: privileged, ignorant, and out of touch. I think we should go to commercial. Colbert finally whispered, his voice barely audible. Actually, I'd like to say one more thing, Noam said, turning to address the camera directly. To the people watching at home, don't let anyone tell you that your voice doesn't matter because of where you live or what you do for work. Don't let coastal elites convince you that their education makes them better than your experience. She stood up and began removing her microphone. Stephen Colbert represents everything that's wrong with modern media. Privileged people looking down on working Americans while pretending to be their champions. The real joke isn't on rural Americans. It's on anyone who thinks this kind of elitist condescension passes for comedy. The show limped through the remaining segments, but Colbert's confidence was completely destroyed. His monologue fell flat. His interviews were awkward, and his usual quick wit was nowhere to be found. Within hours, clips of the interview were viral across every platform. But unlike Colbert's usual viral moments, where he appeared to destroy conservative guests, these clips showed him being systematically outclassed by someone he'd completely underestimated. The response was immediate and brutal. Working-class Americans who'd never heard of Kristi Noem before were sharing their own stories of being looked down on by coastal elites. Comedy critics began questioning whether Colbert's brand of elitist humor was still relevant in an increasingly populist political climate. But the real damage came from his own audience. Liberal viewers who'd supported Colbert for years were shocked to see him so thoroughly exposed as out of touch and unprepared. Comments on CBS's social media pages were devastating. How did he not see that coming? She made him look like everything he claims to hate. Maybe it's time for comedy that doesn't punch down at working people. The cultural impact was even more significant. Noam's systematic exposure of Colbert's privilege had struck a nerve with Americans across the political spectrum, who were tired of being lectured by wealthy entertainers. Her defense of working-class dignity resonated far beyond traditional Republican voters. Within a week, Colbert's ratings had dropped by 30% as viewers abandoned a show that had been exposed as elitist propaganda disguised as comedy. Major advertisers began pulling their sponsorships, worried about being associated with content that mocked working Americans. The breaking point came when CBS executives, facing mounting pressure from affiliates in rural markets, called an emergency meeting to discuss Colbert's future. The interview with Noam had become a liability, showing that their star host could be easily outmaneuvered by politicians he'd tried to mock. 3 months after the disastrous interview, CBS announced that The Late Show would be ending its run, with Colbert pursuing other creative opportunities. Sanom. The official statement thanked him for his passionate comedy, but notably avoided defending his approach to political humor. Colbert's departure marked the end of an era in late-night television, where coastal comedians could mock rural Americans without consequence. His humiliation by Noam had shown that the old model of elitist humor was no longer sustainable in an increasingly connected world. Noam, meanwhile, saw her national profile skyrocket. The interview had showcased not just her political skills, but her ability to defend working-class Americans against elite condescension. Political strategists from both parties began studying her approach as a model for how to handle hostile media. In her first major interview after Colbert's show was canceled, Noam was asked what she'd hoped to accomplish in that confrontation. "I wanted to show working Americans that they don't have to accept being looked down on by people who've never lived their lives," she said. "Stephen Colbert thought he could humiliate me because I'm from a rural state, because I don't have the right kind of education, because I represent people he considers beneath him." She continued, "But what he discovered is that real experience beats inherited privilege every time. Working people don't need to be defended by coastal elites. They can defend themselves when given the opportunity." The interviewer asked if she felt vindicated by Colbert's downfall. "This was never about destroying Stephen Colbert personally," Noam replied. "It was about standing up for the dignity of working Americans who've been mocked and dismissed by people like him for too long." The lesson was clear in an age of populist politics and social media accountability. Elitist condescension can backfire spectacularly when it encounters someone who's actually lived the life they're mocking. And when inherited privilege meets earned experience, authenticity wins every time. Stephen Colbert thought he could humiliate Kristi Noem with jokes about dumb blonde politicians from flyover states, using his platform to mock someone he saw as an easy target for his sophisticated urban audience. Instead, he exposed himself as everything he claimed to oppose: privileged, ignorant, and completely disconnected from the working Americans he pretended to champion. His career-ending encounter with Noam became a perfect example of what happens when elitist comedy meets authentic experience. When someone who's never worked a real job tries to mock someone who's built their life from the ground up, and when the joke finally ends up being on the comedian who thought he was untouchable.